Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Kevin Allison. I'm an urban soil health specialist with the Marion County Soil and Water Conservation District in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm joined by Ellie Blaine, who is the program director for the Indiana Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts Urban Soil Health Program. And we both, our work is supported by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. USDA-NRCS is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender. So this session is going to be on terminating cover crops in a no-till garden. And just to give you some context, I am in Indiana, so some of these cover crop recommendations and timings might be a little Indiana specific, but I hope you can translate them to your region, your garden, and your farm. So also a little bit about context. When I go to a garden, and I think you've probably heard this whole soil health movement and people trying to regenerate the soil for agriculture. Same thing in a garden. So I think about soil life when I'm almost planting or doing any activity out in the garden. So minimizing disturbance, just following these four principles: minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, maximize continuous living roots, and maximize biodiversity. So cover crops help me get a lot of that done. So when I'm growing a cover crop, I just know that those root exudates and the biomass and all the vegetation is going to become food for life in the soil. It helps regulate water by adding organic matter. There's pore space that's created by cover crop roots, which lets air flow through, and then reducing tillage in combination with all that food just help those microorganisms in the soil construct their ecosystems. So that just allows for better root penetration, more nutrient cycling, and soil health in general. All right, so let's get to, cover crops are beautiful and they help a lot, but let's talk about how to kill them, because that's what we're here for. I'm gonna stop the video quick. All right. So this is my garden in Indianapolis at the Eagle Creek Demonstration Garden on the west side. Anybody's welcome to meet me out there anytime. Just reach out. We've got workshops there as well. So this is my garden layout. I kind of label my 30-inch wide beds, and then I've got my walkways in between each bed. So A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. You can see this is actually a picture taken in spring about this time of year last year. So A1, you can see a lot of residue or just dead cover crops on that bed. That is a winter killed cover crop, and we'll go into detail on all this a lot more, but just in a high level overview, A1, for example, is a winter killed cover crop. Skipping over to like A5 and A4, you can see the difference. Those are overwintered cover crops that have a lot of biomass, and they're growing strong in the spring, so they did not die during the winter time. A3 is kind of a combination. It did have some winter killed cover crops in it, like oats. They had since died off in the winter, and what's growing there is legumes. So there's probably some crimson clover and some hairy vetch in A3. Those cover crops are also in those high biomass mixes like A4 and A5. So we're going to kind of go through each one of these and talk about how to terminate them. But in general, what I'm looking for is for them to die so I can plant spring vegetables. So in the bed in the foreground where you see the spinach that needed thinned, that was an oats cover crop that had died, and so it's set up for early vegetables. And then the bed in the background in the middle that has straw on it, that was actually a cover crop that was terminated and then transplanted into. All right, I'm going to pause just a second. I get in the chat that there's a little bit of static in no changing. Ellie, can you let me know, is the slide still static, or are we on the slide that has the spinach in the foreground?
We are now. There is a little bit of a lag. I'd say 5 seconds or so, maybe, between when you start talking about the slide and the next slide.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right, cool. Okay, well, soon you shall be seeing a slide that says cover crop termination methods. So these are the ones that we're going to go into in depth. So winter kill and freeze, so cover crops that die during the winter time. Mowing and cutting is also a method that can be used to terminate cover crops. crimping, which is basically breaking the stem of a plant so that water cannot flow from the roots through the stem, and it kills the plant. A tarp, which you can imagine is a black tarp that blocks out sunlight, and then mulch. So using things like straw to help in terminating cover crops. So you can't, maybe an FYI, you can't just throw straw on a cover crop and expect it to die. Those are it's more of a supplemental termination method. And I'll give you some details on that coming up. Okay, so just high level freeze. There's going to be crops that winter kill, cover crops that winter kill, like oats on the left, and then there's going to be some that overwinter, like cereal rye on the right. Mowing and cutting, it's most effective on annual legumes, and it's most effective at the flowering stage. So when a legume is putting its energy into reproduction and flower, but before it makes seed, because in general you don't want a cover crop reseeding on your garden bed. But when it is flowering, you can cut it, and it should die. And we'll talk about that should, but it is most effective at flowering stage. Crimp, same thing. If it is also more effective at flowering stage or anthesis, which is when the cereal rye or a grain is making pollen. And so crimping is most effective on grasses, and legumes are a little bit hard to crimp. So I want to show you what that looks like, what flowering looks like on cereal rye. On the left, that's the pollen kind of dripping off the grain head. So that's the right time to cut or crimp if you want to kill that plant. On the right, there's two legumes. You can see crimson clover. Oh, Ellie. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to take another pause. Ellie's just now seeing the crimp slide, which is way behind me.
Sorry, now we're at the pollen rye on the left. And
Okay.
crimson.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you. Maybe the weather. I don't know. So on the right, you can see crimson clover in the foreground and hairy vetch in the background. So those are two different legumes, and one is flowering, in April, and one is not quite yet flowered. So I will say that if you were to mow that or cut that cover crop right now, at this stage, the crimson clover might die, and the hairy vetch would probably regrow because it hasn't flowered yet. Just wanted to show a picture just to kind of sum that up. So the cereal rye might regrow after cutting if it was cut too early before anthesis. And then the hairy vetch, because it's a legume, it's a little bit hard to crimp at the hand scale. So when you crimp the rye, let's say it's a cereal rye and hairy vetch mix that gets crimped, the cereal rye would die, and then the hairy vetch might regrow. Okay, so that's going to lead us into tarps, which is kind of like the silver bullet in kind of being able to disregard all that regrowth and kind of just make sure we get an effective kill. So I like to use tarps often in combination with other termination methods. So I will cut, mow, or crimp a cover crop and then tarp it. And that tarp just blocks the light. 3 to 4 weeks in the spring usually does it. It's less in the summertime when it's a little bit hotter. The duration depends on temperature and species vigor. So some crops and cover crops are going to be easier to kill, and usually those are like the tender ones, like legumes, or something like cereal rye, which is more of a bulky cover crop and a vigorous cover crop. It might take something more like 3 to 4 weeks in the spring. I do want to mention that there's also solarization. So occultation is a fancy word for just blocking out the light, which is what a black tarp does. I will say that if you get, like a light blue tarp and there's light coming through, it might not kill the cover crop like you'd want it to. So I do recommend black, or at least, blocking the light somehow. Solarization, I don't have any pictures for this, but I do want to say that some folks are using clear plastic to not block the light, but intensify the light and the heat to kill a cover crop. So if we have any questions on that in the Q&A, I'd be happy to field those. But in general, I would just caution you that, once you get past, 5 days, or if it's like really, really hot, like you can really start burning up and hurting soil life. So that's a kind of a high management way of terminating cover crops. You definitely want to be checking on your soil health. Okay, so I've just got, for those of you that aren't familiar with tarps, they're commonly used in small scale agriculture. This is just a picture of regrowth from a beet leaf crop, and it was tarped, and you can see on the right that tender crop, the tender beet leaves have decomposed, and that's probably 3 weeks later, and that bed's ready for plant. So that's not necessarily on how to kill a cover crop, but just wanted to show you how tarps can be used. Here's a couple pictures from a farm. With tarping, you can see that there's on the left, it's been tarped, and that soil it almost looks bare. There's a little bit of residue on it, but that must have been a low residue crop or cover crop that just decomposed. So of course, if you have something like cereal rye and it's 5 foot tall and you put a tarp on it, when you pull that tarp off in 3 weeks, it's not going to look like that. There's going to be residue on the soil surface. And then mulching. So again, like the idea is to block the light, and it's supplemental to other methods. So a tarp will definitely block the light, right? And mulching can also do that. You just got to get it thick enough. So I'll go into some more details when I show you like crop sequences and kind of real life examples. But yeah, in general, like this is a good picture to illustrate, what mulching could do. Like there's a cover crop that's been terminated. It looks like it's been mowed or cut. He is mulching the pathways with paper, like newsprint and straw. You could easily put some more straw on top of that cover crop and then tarp it for a few weeks. So yeah, then that would kill everything and leave you with a nice bed to plant into. Okay, so I'm going to go through some tools before we get into examples, just tools that help me kind of figure out, what cover crops can be killed in certain ways, and just some tools that we might need. So some cover crop tables I'll show you. I'll show you my crop plan and how I kind of figure what my plan is going to be for terminating in the spring. Sometimes you need freezing temperatures as a tool to kill cover crops that are supposed to winter kill. So you'll notice like I talk a lot about oats dying in the wintertime. So just realize that, if you're in Alabama, oats might not die during the wintertime. So I'd encourage you to check with your local soil and water conservation districts or extension to figure out more about the cover crops in your region. A cutting tool that could be shears, a flail mower if you're on a big scale. It could be a lawnmower. It could be a weed eater. So there's different cutting tools that can be used. Mulch, compost is always helpful. Tarp and sandbags or something heavy to hold down those tarps because wind can get under them and blow them. So you want to get those secured. And then I'll show some resources and support at the end. So tables. If
Kevin,
you go to Marion, yep.
Just to interrupt really quickly on tarping, there's a couple questions in the chat. If we could just cover real quick about the tarping approach, does that work on significant problem species such as hemlock and hogweed?
So some of the perennials, it just takes longer. Like I say 3 weeks to kill an annual, cereal rye. But something like a dandelion or just different perennials, like it might take longer than that. So some might even take like a full season. I find that it sets them back though. It sets the perennials back and sometimes kills them. But yeah, specifically hemlock and hogweed, I'm not sure exactly how long it would take. But yes, I think it would help to do it for a longer period of time though.
And then I think you'll get into this a little bit more, but after tarping, do you need to do anything to the soil?
Yeah, I'll give some examples of that. Yep, we'll get into it. Thank you, Ellie.
And tarp's impact on microorganisms.
I've asked that same question too. If you tarp and it's hot and it's dry under the soil, like eventually, that soil is gonna be dry. If there's not much food, like maybe if there's straw underneath it, that would help. But if it's like if it's bare ground and it's tarped, think of that like, a full season, like, and you do it for like a whole year or a whole summer, That's a lot of heat, and you probably are damaging some microorganisms, would be my guess. But I've talked to some microbiologists, and in general, like 4 weeks in the spring probably isn't going to impact it that much, impact microbiology that much. I actually do see a lot of earthworm activity underneath those tarps. And it might be because they think it's night and they're coming up for food, but there's usually a lot of activity. So yeah, I'm usually not too worried about the microorganisms underneath the tarp, but great question.
All right, carry on. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so this table is available at marionswcd.org on the soil health tab. And I just want to draw your attention to that winter survival column. So that's kind of where I start. Like, okay, do I want this cover crop to die or in the winter time? Because that's an easy termination. Or do I want it to live and give me benefits in the spring? So you can just see, yeah, winter survival. If it's never, then it's not going to live. Like oats, for example, is seldom. Occasionally they survive, but in general they die. Whereas something like crimson clover and cereal rye are hardy cover crops, and they will usually survive the winter into the spring. There's also a table in SARE Managing Cover Crops Profitably that has some good detail in their charts as far as, you know, is each cover crop, how easy is it to till kill? How easy is it to mow kill? So the ones that have more shaded in their circles, it's more easily to do so. So for example, like rye, you know, a mow kill is full, so you can kill it with mowing. So that's a helpful a chart if you need some more information on this, on each cover crop. And then this is draft. I do apologize, but it will be on the internet somewhat soon. But this is just kind of laying out which cover crops will, different methods to kill each cover crop. So I've kind of got it sorted out by grasses and legumes. But I think rather than dwelling on this too much, my main takeaway here would be that in general, mowing and cutting is a little bit easier to use with the legumes, and then the crimping is a little bit more applicable to tall grasses. And then that tarp column I just made just to remind myself that, yeah, like you can kill almost any of these things with a tarp. Okay. So another thing to keep in mind is like just growth cycles of these cover crops. So, you know, oats, radish, and field peas, let's say those are all winter killed cover crops. Let's say we plant them in August. By December or January, they're going to be dead and leave like a mulch on the bed in January and March. And so a bed like that would be plantable in March. Whereas something like cereal rye or crimson clover or hairy vetch are going to overwinter. And the cereal rye might be going through anthesis or pollination in like May or June. Crimson clover might be going in April to flower, and hairy vetch might be going sometime in like May, at least in Indiana. Okay, so that leads me into a crop plan. So, and I'm going to go through each of these with examples. So, but in general, I've got like a winter killed cover crop like oats, field peas, and radish. It's going to die during the winter time. So in March, that's when I'm planting in those beds like leafy greens, onions, peas. You can see that the gray shaded area is like a tarp. So if I do have weed pressure in those winter killed beds, or if I'm not planting till April, I usually take March and I'll tarp those. I'll put a tarp over the dead cover crop just to make sure that all of the chickweed and any perennials just get set back and killed, and then plant those crops in April. Overwintering low biomass. So those are like things like oats and legumes. And I know that's a big word, overwintering low biomass, but basically cover crops that overwinter that don't have cereal rye in them. That's kind of my classification for that. Like cereal rye makes it a high biomass like mix it's just big and bulky. So oats and legumes, the oats will die, the legumes will survive, and they're a little bit easier to kill with mowing and mulching, as opposed to the cereal rye where it's really helpful to have a tarp. And again, I'll go through examples of these. Let's start out with winter killed. Okay, so this is a winter killed cover crop. On the top, that's what it looks like in the fall. In the spring, that's what you got on the bottom. So just a bed with dead residue. If you plant the cover crop earlier in the fall, the previous year, you're going to get more biomass, like you can see on the left, there's a picture of oats that are a little bit bigger, and then there's some that are smaller, but they're both dead. In general, my go-to on this is just to rake that dead mulch off the bed in the spring and then seed a crop. So this is what that could look like in the spring. You can see a bed in the background that has some big grass. That's cereal rye overwintered. In the foreground, that's also cereal rye, but then the two beds in the middle were oats and field peas and winter killed cover crops that were dead. The residue was raked off into the walkways. I put a little compost on the top of the bed, and that's where things like onions and spinach got planted. Just roll through some more pictures. There's straw, or not straw, sorry, that's oats straw, so dead oats that were raked off the bed, and then this grower seeded lettuce on the beds. You can leave the dead mulch on the bed if there's enough of it and transplant into it. I think that's also a good possibility as well. However, I do think that seeding is a little tricky if you leave that residue on. And I think that's why I just rake it off. I love leaving the mulch on the bed when I can, just because it feeds soil life, it protects the soil, it stops it from cracking, conserves moisture, so many benefits. But my hope is to also get a crop up and going really fast. So you can see my daughter here planting some lettuce and spinach and some very high, dead winter killed residue. It did germinate and it came up and we ate it, the lettuce, it's all good. But I think if you're like really wanting perfect production and perfect rows and perfect germination, then this might impede that just a little bit. However, I have found that like things like peas in the spring, that works. Peas in general work well with straw. So in similar thinking, just leave that oat mulch on the bed and plant the peas into it, and they should do just fine. So here's an example of, again, raked off the bed and the bed planted with early spring crops. There's onions transplanted into a winter killed cover crop that had been raked off. There's some weeds. So yeah, cover crops are awesome at suppressing weeds, but sometimes they're not perfect. So in the spring, this is like dead oats, and then you've got some weeds coming up in it. So if there's a lot, I just pick them. But if they're, if there's not a lot, I might just pick them. But if there is a lot and I've got time, I do like to put a tarp over it. So that's a whole plot of oats and winter killed species that was tarped in March to prepare for April plantings. There's just another bed of dead oats that's being, the tarp being pulled off the dead oats. That's what it looks like. You can see that, I think I'm not sure, that might be a perennial weed right there that is struggling. So that tarp actually in the springtime did a number on it. It set it back a lot and maybe even killed it. However, I wasn't ready to leave the tarp on for another couple of weeks to make sure it was dead. So I just went through that bed and weeded it. And that's the weeds that I got out. So yes, pulling perennial weeds out of the bed is probably beneficial. And then this is what it looks like after the tarp comes off. So you've got a pretty nice clean bed that could be either seeded, transplanted into, and then you can see the bed on the right that's still got the dead mulch on it. And in this next picture, they're both cleaned up. So the straw, or the oat straw, was raked off the bed into the walkways, and then that will be planted with spinach or onions or some of those spring vegetables. Okay. I will say that like for the onion bed this spring, I actually broad forked, which breaks up a little bit of compaction. If you're not familiar with broad forking, you can kind of look it up on the internet, but it's pretty much taking this broad fork, this actual piece of equipment, or something like a digging fork, and just putting it into the ground and then rocking it backwards, and then sliding it out, not flipping the soil, but just kind of cracking it and letting some air in and breaking up compaction. So I find that to be helpful, especially if you're on a garden that is very compacted. Over time, soil health will start taking care of that. Cover crops will start taking care of that compaction. but this does accelerate, the decompaction of soil. So for example, I might do this before onions that are in the ground for a long time and that need that, they don't like compaction. So I might crack the ground and then plant the onions. So I will say that you can prepare a bed before you tarp it, or you can prepare it after you tarp it. Sometimes I think that preparing the seed bed or putting compost on or doing this broad forking is beneficial before you tarp, mainly because you're disturbing the soil just a little bit and that might germinate some weed seeds. So if you germinate those weeds, then the tarp goes on and kills them, as opposed to putting the tarp on and then removing the tarp, preparing a seed bed and then having a weed flush then. So I kind of like to have my weed flush happen underneath the tarp, so it kills it. Okay, so that was a winter kill cover crop. Now we're going to go into some the tactics that I use to plant things like in April, like transplants like kale. Okay, so for an overwintering low biomass mix, I often use things like oats and legumes. So the oats are going to die during the wintertime and the legumes are going to survive. You can cut them. I use a sickle sometimes. You could use a weed eater. This is actually hairy vetch, very thick hairy vetch all over these raised beds. The grower on the right actually took the cutting and windrowed it just to let it dry out a little bit before she put that mulch back on the bed. So when I say low biomass mix and I talk about legumes, I'm not necessarily sure I mean low biomass, because you can actually get a lot of vegetation and a lot of mulch out of legumes as well. So as I said, like the best time to cut these flowers are when they are flowering. So that's hairy vetch on the left and crimson clover on the right, ready to be cut. However, that sometimes happens in May. Sometimes I have both of those species or multiple species and the flowering times are different. So I like to cut them when I need to cut them. And by that, I mean, so I'm planting kale in this bed, for example, in let's say April 15th or April 20th, then I'm going to want to kill that cover crop before planting time. So granted, I'm not getting the full benefit of that cover crop going to flower and producing a lot of nitrogen, but I am killing it and still getting some benefits with the microbiology and the roots. So this particular bed was cut, weed whacked, and then I like to put straw on top of that and plant about 10 days later. If I open up transplant holes before about 10 days, that some of those cover crops might regrow, because again, we've cut it before flower, so it might have the vigor to regrow. So keeping that occultation, that light out, and just making sure that cover crop is dead is beneficial before opening up transplant holes. I also find that just even one sheet of like newspaper over those cut legumes and then straw on top goes a long way. I've done a little bit of just personal trials that when I've got the newspaper and the straw on top of a cut legume, there's a lot less regrowth and a lot longer lasting weed suppression. So again, yeah, if you open up that transplant hole before 10 days, or immediately after doing, cutting it and putting straw on, you might get some regrowth coming out of those transplant holes of like crimson clover. So.
And Kevin, can you just verify your planting schedule for the crimson and that this is a spring planting of kale?
Yep. Yeah. So far, all these cover crops that we've talked about were planted in the fall. So after tomatoes come out, or after, whatever crop comes out in the fall, like usually I'm trying to plant in September, August, late August if I can, but September, and some of the cereal rye, you can plant in as late as October too. So yeah, all these cover crops are fall planted, and then some of them die, where I do the early spring crops, and then some of like the beds that are doing later crops, I like to have cover crops that live into the spring and overwinter, so that spring benefit and through biology, just soil cover and biodiversity. So yeah, these kale were actually, so for example, this was probably cut down like the beginning of April. Let's say April 10th, the cover crop's cut, a layer of newspaper put over it, a layer of straw put over it, wait 10 days, and then April 20th, transplant the kale into it. that helps. So maybe in FYI too, I just want to put this chart in here because I find it helpful in thinking about, okay, kale likes nitrogen. Kale's a brassica, like it's a heavy feeder. So that's another reason I like to have these legumes planted before it, because legume cover crops provide nitrogen to the following crop. So you can see on this chart, like the date of cover crop termination on the bottom. If you kill something like a legume on beginning of April, it might only give you, let's say, 20 pounds per acre of nitrogen. Whereas if you let it go to flower, like where it's more like maybe April 15th, where it's budding, that's when a legume really starts increasing its nitrogen, the creation of nitrogen. So, so it is great to wait and let that legume kind of fill out and do its job. But at the same time, sometimes it's really beneficial to make sure it's dead before planting. So that sometimes that means killing it early. I did want to, I saw over there in the questions, why do you add straw on the bed before transplanting? My main goal there, go back one. So these legumes of this, in the case of this tactic here, the legumes like hairy vetch and crimson clover, they decompose really, really fast. So after that's cut, like there's going to be, that residue might be gone in, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, depends, right? But it's not, you don't get as much mulch out of legumes as you would cereal rye. So yes, in that one picture I showed you a whole bunch of hairy vetch mulch that actually is got such a low carbon and nitrogen ratio that it just gets decomposed very quickly by soil microorganisms. So in the case of kale, I prefer having like a soil cover on it, like almost the entire season. It's going to be producing for a few months. So I like to just seal the deal on weed suppression if I can. So that dead, the legume that's been killed gives me a little bit of nitrogen. It gives me some biology down there, and then that layer of paper, the layer of straw, is kind of sealing the deal on weed suppression for a few months. So that's a good question. Thank you. All right, cool. And hope we're on the same picture now. But this is corn planted, and in the middle, actually on the right, you can see a bunch of grass. That's actually a summer cover crop called sorghum sedan grass. But I wanted you to pay attention to the corn. I like using the same tactic that I use with kale on corn because it likes nitrogen. So those are that's a legume cover crop that's dead there. I will say that, I don't mulch corn because I'm seeding it. So I wouldn't put a bunch of straw and newspaper down because I wouldn't be able to seed it very easily. So in this case, it's just making furrows in that mulch or removing the mulch and then making your rows and seeding the corn into it. Okay. So overwintering high biomass. These are like just a high biomass mix with cereal rye. And you'll know what I mean by high biomass once you see pictures of cereal rye. But those are planted also in the fall. In February, March, and April, they're growing tall. So if you remember that chart that showed the cereal rye growth, like approximate growth stages, it could be May or June before that starts going through enthesis when it's time to cut or crimp. By May and June, I like to have my crops in the ground. I don't know about you. So it's very helpful to kill those things, be able to kill those cover crops early in order to be able to plant. So if I'm planting tomatoes on May 10th or peppers on May 10th, I'm thinking, okay, I need to crimp or cut this cover crop and then tarp it for 3 to 4 weeks before May 10th. So what I like to do, I just say, okay, May 10th, let's go back a month. That's April 10th. So yeah, maybe April 15th, I'm going to crimp or cut this cover crop and then get a tarp on it for a month and then pull it off and then plant my vegetables. Let me show you how that's done. So this is a cover crop that has like cereal rye and hairy vetch that has gone to enthesis. So this is probably like late May. So yes, you can cut this down and transplant something like a tomato into it. So on a raised bed like this, like I think that's great. Like if you had a huge garden, it gets a little bit tricky because it doesn't, it might not give you 100% weed suppression. So some of those weeds might come up out of there. There might be some regrowth of the cover crop. So straw on top of that would definitely help. But in general, if we can crimp, or if we can put a tarp on that for a period of time, it's going to be better off throughout the rest of the season. So it is possible, and I've done it before I was introduced to tarps. I did a lot of this, and it works. But I am thankful to have the tarp just to kind of make things a lot easier. Okay, so this is a picture of that high biomass cover crop crimped. So you can see it's just flattened to the ground. Picture, I put a tarp on it, and 3 weeks later, I think the picture on the left is probably like 2 weeks later, you can see that residue starting to yellow and die. And then 4 weeks later on the right, you've got just dead biomass. So that's cereal rye. The hairy vetch you can probably not even see in the picture on the right, or the crimson clover, because it has decomposed underneath that tarp. That long-lasting residue of something like a rye is going to stick around for mulch and weed suppression. So if I'm planting into that, you can either do seed or you can transplant. And again, while I've experimented with it and it's worked some, seeding lettuce or spinach into that much biomass or that much mulch can be a little bit difficult, and germination can be a little bit spotty. So there's definitely ways of doing that. You could kind of pull away a seed furrow, you could kind of pull the mulch away and kind of create a furrow and get it seeded. But in general, I like to keep this tactic for like larger seeded crops like beans and squash. So in general, those are the two crops that I like to do after a crimped and tarped cereal rye cover crop. And then transplanting, I would transplant just about anything to that. So peppers, tomatoes, squash. Yeah. So you can either seed into it with a large seed like beans and squash, or transplant things like tomatoes and peppers. Here's some pictures of squash coming up after that rye. So I like having that mulch on the ground. It just keeps the soil moisture intact, the temperature regulated, the soil fed, and the vegetables clean. And on the right, you can see that squash growing and doing just fine. Here's a picture of beans. So while I understand that, yeah, it is a little bit tricky to plant. I think in a couple pictures ago, you saw a picture of a trowel and hand planting one bean seed at a time. If you're on a bigger scale, like maybe a jab planter of some sorts, like you just jab the seed in the ground, kind of an old time machine, but it would be doable. But for my small scale garden, I'm only doing 2 rows so that's maybe like 75 feet total. So yeah, doing this by hand isn't that big of a problem for me. So just something to consider. So what about weeds? I think I've said a couple of times that cover crops are awesome at weed suppression, but also there can be weeds that pop up in them. So I like to go through and pick the weeds if I can. I try to make a run through in the fall and the spring just to make sure I've got the bad ones out. I try not to let anything go to seed. It's not always possible, but yeah, I just try my best. But if it's starting to get weedy and it's just too much for me to weed, then I might consider tarping early. And there's also some considerations to tarp early. Like let's say I accidentally planted cereal rye in a bed where I needed to, or let's say I had I didn't use enough winter coat cover crops. I planted everything in rye and I need to kill it. So you can kill rye early if you give it long enough underneath a tarp. So for example, this is a cereal rye cover crop that's only like about 12 inches tall, maybe 18 inches tall. And this was actually just a couple of days ago. So mid-April that I was finally able to crimp it with my foot. So this actually is a stage picture. In the big fields, like they use these big roller crimpers that smash the stems, crack the stems of these these cover crops. Whereas on the small scale, I like to use my foot. So this is staged because she weighs about 50 pounds, and it might take a little bit more than that and maybe a bigger shoe size to really get that grass down and cracked. But the goal is to just crack that stem at the base. Some folks use like a T-post with two like ropes on the side where you can actually walk that T-post over the cereal rye stand, and then just kind of press on it to try to get that the metal to kind of crack additional parts of the stem. But I do like to lay it all one way. It just helps. It helps when planting. It helps keep everything nice and clean. If I really needed to kill this cover crop before this stage where I could actually crack the stem, then I would just have weed eated it and tarped it. So once it's big enough, which it actually surprises me that at like 14 inches, like it is crackable, like you can actually crimp it. But yeah, if it was before that, I would probably weed eat. And the reason that I like to crimp so much is because it doesn't chop up the residue into pieces. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you want it chopped up into pieces. But when you do chop it into pieces and tarp it, it will decompose a lot faster than if you were to just crimp it and leave the kind of plant intact. So crimping does leave a longer lasting mulch, it seems, whereas weed eating or weed whacking and covering with the tarp will accelerate the decomposition. So I did mention, like, yeah, what if I planted rye on a bed and I was like, in the wintertime, like I'm all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, I want to plant more onions this year or more lettuce, and there's cereal rye in that bed. That can be tricky. So I did this spring take the opportunity to try a couple of things, and in this case the rye was maybe like 4 inches tall, and I just put straw on it and put a tarp over it. And then about 5 weeks later, I pulled the tarp off and the rye was pretty much dead. So we just cut off the light when it was young. I think that weed eating, like if it was maybe 8 inches, weed eating would accelerate that kill process. But definitely you would need a tarp or some kind of, definitely need to block the light out. Straw, I think just straw on top of it probably wouldn't do the trick. There'd be enough light to get through that it would come out and regrow. So just as an overview, this is, back to the spring crop plan. That's kind of like my strategy and the ways that I kill cover crops in my garden. Using winter kill before early vegetables, using legumes before things like kale and corn, and either killing them with mulch, like cutting and mulching, or cutting or crimping in a tarp. And then the high biomass mixes with cereal rye, I like to let those grow as tall as I can in the spring and then crimp them down with my foot or a T-post. And there's probably all sorts of other tools you could use. A lot of the growers that are on the market farm scale would use a flail mower that just has a really good cut on it, and then they would tarp it and then tarp off in May or whenever I'm planting, and ready to go. So before Q&A, I just want to let you know that there's also some awesome resources out there. These are some of my favorites. Managing Cover Crops Profitably book. If you're new to cover crops or you want to learn more, that book has about 5 pages on each cover crop, and it's a pretty simple read. Like it's not overwhelming amount of information, but it's enough to really get you educated. So it's also got some tables that talk about which cover crops are good for what, and so just really highly recommend that book. There's a free PDF online as well. Crop rotation on organic farms is also another good one that talks about using cover crops in rotations. And then these books here on the left, I can't say enough about Jesse Frost and the Living Soil Handbook and no-tillgrowers.com. They just have a wealth of information there. The book's really good. They explore a lot of what we talked about today in the context of no-till growing, and also maybe even at a little bit larger scale. So, like a 3/4 acre farm. So if you're at that scale and want a little bit more information about that, I'd highly recommend that book and the No-Till Growers website. John Martin Fortier, The Market Gardener. I like that book because he really does well of explaining the raised bed system, like the 30-inch wide raised bed with the walkways, or a 4-foot wide raised bed, and just how to manage them. He's also got some really good tables about how to how to plant vegetables on those beds. Like he likes to use, for example, like 3 rows of lettuce down or 3 rows of spinach down a 30-inch bed, or 2 rows of kale. So he's kind of got tables that makes sense as far as what fits on these raised beds. Daniel May's no-till organic vegetable farm. He's a large-scale farm in Maine. And by large scale, I mean like an acre, acre and a half. I'm not sure how much Daniel's got out there, but he does a lot of leaf mulch, and he's not even at that scale, he's not really using a flail mower, or he's not using like a power harrow or anything to disturb the soil. He's just using a lot of like compost and leaf mulch and cover crops to keep his farm no-till. So very, very interesting book. Elliot Coleman, the new organic grower, he's also just got a lot of information about raised bed systems. Ben Hartman is also a great book, and it's in Indiana. And then Brian O'Hare, the no-till intensive vegetable culture book, another Maine farm in Maine, but also has great information about just the tactics that we talked about. Also here locally, I recommend that you check out the Marion SWCD.org page. On the soil health tab, there's some of these resources available. I'd encourage growers to reach out to urbansoilhealth.org, which is Ellie's website and Ellie's organization's website. And they are connecting growers and having lots of workshops around the state of Indiana. And so I'd highly recommend that you get in touch with her and just get connected with other gardeners doing this kind of stuff. And just always feel free to reach out to your local soil and water conservation district, your USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, or your local Purdue Extension as well, as they might have some good information and probably would like to talk to you about using conservation in agriculture. So with that, I hope the slides weren't too skippy, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to field them.
That was awesome, Kevin. Thank you. And just going back to the chat a little bit, there were a couple of questions I answered somewhat, but would love to put to you too. One of which was from Marion Sweeney from Marion County SWCD, and she and their group is starting a demo garden this year, a few raised beds at a community garden, and is looking for cover crop recommendations to plant where to have a fall cover crop event to show different summer and essentially plant a fall cover crop or two. So I mentioned sorghum, Sudan grass, sun hemp, maybe buckwheat, Lacey Facilia, maybe some sunflowers in there, but
okay. Yeah.
If you want to pick that up.
Yeah. Great question. So in springtime, like it's helpful to get cover crops planted in the fall. If you can't, then it's great to mulch the bed with straw, just to keep it covered during the winter. If for some reason you've got a bed that was, bare or straw, and you really wanted to get a cover crop in the spring, a cover crop like oats can be planted in like April. And they'll grow, and probably, it's almost like you'd plant oats in the spring to have an oats crop. But those will probably, I can't remember, maybe June, they might be going to seed. So you can do that. You could always, you could weed whack that mix in May or April or whenever you want to. But really, I guess what I want to say here, you want ample growth, right? Like planting a oats and peas right now, if you were really gonna like weed whack it and kill it and tarp it in like beginning of May, you might only get like a couple inches of growth out of it. So just measure, I guess make that decision, and that might be okay. Like at least it's something, right? At least it's some roots in the ground. Or you could let it get bulkier and get more biomass, and then maybe in beginning of June you kill it, and that might work into your rotation depending on what you want to plant. And then like a summer cover crop. Let me share my screen one more time. Lost my little Zoom thing. Okay, share my screen one more time. Okay, can you see that okay? It should be a picture of sorghum sand grass.
Almost, not quite.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. So that's actually that's a farm that's, you see the little yellow flowers, that's actually sun hemp. It's a legume. And then that kind of ropey like plant. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. It's hard to distinguish, but there's some sorghum sand grass and some sun hemp in there. So those actually are two plants that grow like really, really tall. The legume is the sun hemp, good for nitrogen. The grass, like the sorghum, great for breaking up compaction, etc. So a couple of things that you can do with this, like I like to use sorghum sand grass and sun hemp and some other winter or summer cover crops like buckwheat, for example. After, like, let's say a harvest in garlic or onions in June or July, then that's a really great summer cover crop to just either use for the rest of the season and like have your season, like just leave it there and let it ride it out, or kill it in, let's say, August and then plant something in September into that bed. So I'll give you a sequence of what that looks like. It gets really tall. On the left there, that's a mowed or weed whacked summer cover crop. See, it's just laying there on the bed. And then on the right, it's a crimped summer cover crop, so which gives you more biomass and more mulch, right? So I would do that and then just tarp it and then transplant into it after the tarp. So that's what that lettuce could look like in a planted lettuce into a dead sorghum sand grass cover crop. So yeah, it usually takes like, okay, so let's say the sorghum sand grass is, I don't know, 3 feet tall. It can get up to like 6 or 8, but let's say it's 3 feet tall. I planted in July. It's now August, and I want to transplant lettuce on September 1st. Then I'm thinking, okay, September 1st, let's back up 3 weeks. And so that puts me at the beginning of August that I want to kill that cover crop and get a tarp on it. But really, let me back up on that because it's summertime, it's hot. It's probably only going to take about 10 to 15 days to really make sure that cover crop's dead. So a September 1st planting target, transplant lettuce, back up 15 days. That's August 15th. I'm crimping that and putting a tarp on it, or weeding it and putting a tarp on it, and then pulling it off and transplanting in. I will say that if you do let it just go, like sorghum sand grass gets really tall, and it will eventually go to seed if it doesn't die in the winter first. It is a winter killed cover crop, but there are sterile seed, like you can get a sterile seed version of it, so it doesn't actually produce seed, which I think is kind of nice. But in general, it could get really tall, and then in the spring, so it dies during the wintertime. In the spring, this is what it looks like. Like you can see, it's pretty bulky. And I just wanted to show this picture because I personally think, and this next picture is because I personally think that it was a little bit tricky to seed. Like oats are a winter killed cover crop, and I rake them off the bed and I seed spring vegetables into it. Awesome. Sorghum sand grass, however, is a little bit bulkier in that it's more like cereal rye, like just the root structure and just it's just more vigorous. So even though it's been dead all winter, like it's still a little bit tricky to rake off and get the bed clean enough to have like a really clean planting, like seeding. So you can see these lettuce did come up in the sorghum sand grass after sorghum sand grass, but it was just a little bit trickier to do. So yeah, there's a picture of what it looks like in the following spring after it's died. So you can see me trying to rip through it with rip through the soil with a pointed hoe to make furrows for spring seeding. But it was a little bit tricky. Just the bulky roots made it tough. And while I'm talking about sorghum sand grass, I might mention too that it's really nice to be able to take mulch off of the sorghum sand grass during the summer. Let's say plant it in June or July. It grows super tall. I actually have what I call a hay field, like right next to my garden, where I do grow sorghum sand grass for that purpose. And I cut the mulch off and then use it in my garden, and then the sorghum sand grass regrows. However, if you do that on an actual bed, like let's say this bed was garlic and then got planted to sorghum sand grass, and I took a cutting off of it. You can see it was really tall in the background and really short in the foreground. So I took a cutting of mulch. That stalk really, like, as it's regrowing, it really likes to like stiffen up, so it gets more rigid. And I think if you do take cuttings of mulch off a sorghum sandgrass bed in your crop production area, just realize that there might be some like hefty roots, to not necessarily hefty roots, just hefty stems to deal with for a seeding. Hope that makes sense, but it just kind of, they don't lay flat. Like once you cut them and once they regrow, it's a little bit harder to crimp them. It's a little bit harder to weed eat them with a weak weed whacker. They just become a really rigid plant. So if I'm using sorghum sandgrass in a production bed, I don't like to take mulch of it so much. Don't like to take mulch off of it so much. Just like to let it grow enough and then crimp or weed eat just once, and then tarp, and then untarp, and then plant my fall vegetables.
All right.
Oh, yep.
If you do have to go, thank you so much for joining us. Please take a look at save the chat, take a look at those links, and then rejoin us for new Zoom meetings in the future. And a few other questions. Have you used chemical burn down, especially for Canadian thistle? And then what kind of compost do you use?
Yeah. So I don't have that much. Yeah. Like I don't have that much experience with chemical burn downs. I would probably recommend that maybe you talk to Extension for more thorough information on using chemicals. In big agriculture, a lot of the, I know you're not asking about cover crops, you're asking about thistle, but in big ag, so I don't have experience with that. In big ag, a lot of the cover crops are killed with chemicals. So, and it's a whole nother science. But that information is out there. So if you are a producer or a grower that does use that, then reach out. I'm not sure I've got all the answers, but I know we could probably direct you to some good resources for using chemicals with cover crops. Compost. What kind of compost do I use? So that's a good question. Like, I guess I'll just say currently I've got shredded leaves, a pile of shredded leaves at my garden. And so basically, yeah, just shredded leaves. And then I added some good, so let's say 20 parts of shredded leaves and 5 parts of good compost. So I actually added some good compost that I bought from the store. Some of it was composted cow manure, which has got more higher nitrogen content and higher phosphorus and potassium, which I don't always need, but like that's just my mix at the time. So I do like to use a lot of shredded leaves though. I know some other growers, like in Daniel May's book, and Daniel May's farm uses a ton of shredded leaves. The Brian O'Hara book, No-Till Vegetable Culture, he does a mix of wood chips, cow manure, shredded leaves, produce scraps, and he makes sure that those are well composted, and then he uses them as well. So in general, wood chips probably aren't the best to till into your soil, because they'll tie up carbon and nitrogen ratios, they'll pull nitrogen away from the crops. But if it's kind of mixed in right in a good balance with other materials, it could potentially be used on top of a no-till bed as a mulch. But just be careful not to let it fall down into transplant holes, like a wood chip or whatnot, as it might tie up some nitrogen. But yeah, in general, I do like shredded leaf compost, and just maybe broken down for a couple years or 3 years, even better, to put on my beds. If you got additional question on that, yeah, let me know. Yeah, avoid walnut chips or shavings. Very good, Ethan. Yep. Just because of juglin, this chemical in black walnuts, they can be detrimental to I think it's just plant growth and maybe even germination. Can't remember exactly, but they can impede some crops. So try to stay away from black walnut material on a garden if you can. And maybe a little bit on compost too. I know this is probably leaning more towards a nutrient management thing, but my garden's really high in phosphorus. It's really high in potassium. That's kind of the nature of the beast in gardens. It seems just from compost probably too, right? Like just maybe not per se overuse, but just even a slight use of compost will increase those numbers. So I don't fertilize with anything potassium or phosphorus on my garden because it's high already. Well, I say that I don't use like any amendments that have those, but like I do realize that that compost is adding some of that to the soil as well. But so while I would not like to add that extra phosphorus and extra potassium, sometimes like just even a thin layering over a winter kill bed just to help the seeding process. So a winter kill cover crop, you rake it off. Like, yes, it is possible to just seed right into that soil. If you have a little bit of compost, even if it's just a skim layer on top of that bed, it just makes the process of seeding so much easier. It feels like if you are making furrows in it, if you have some compost on top, it feels like it's just a little bit more gentle on the soil quality. You're not like trying to run your hoe through soil. It's more like soil plus organic matter, which it kind of mixes a little bit, and I think is a benefit. Hope I answered that question okay. Yeah, maybe and one more thing on compost, like for example, if you could put compost on in the fall, like while you're planting like a cereal rye, and it'll probably make that cereal rye grow really well, but it does get that, it does allow that cereal rye roots the time to like kind of pull that fertility into even the subsoil. So I think there's some benefit in that as well. I've put compost over growing cereal rye in the spring, and just kind of let it soak in that way too. So there's probably a lot of different timings and amounts that you could use in compost, but I do find it beneficial.
And question about cover crops becoming weeds, essentially. So do seeds from killed sorghum or rye pop up and become weeds after you plant?
Yeah. Yeah, like, so I think that's why the like making sure they're dead and just try to make sure they're dead before planting your crop. And that's where like the tarp, and is super helpful. But yes, there may be some stragglers. In particular, things like buckwheat and hairy vetch are two that I can think of that have hard seed, meaning that not all of that seed will germinate this year. So let's say we plant hairy vetch, say 70% of it germinates, and then 30% might germinate next year. And you might not want hairy vetch germinating in that bed, so that following year. So that I'm probably skewed on the numbers there. It's probably not that much that's hard seed, but yes, it can happen. So yes, and how to deal with that, like, yeah, just once you start to see it coming, just pull it, I guess, would be my recommendation.
I'm going to do a couple maybe quick questions and then pop back to a longer one.
Yep.
Which cover crops are best suitable for intercropping for corn cash crop?
Yep.
That
yeah.
That is from Portugal, so I don't know, your context might be different there if you're asking about, for your situation, Lisa.
Yeah. Yeah. Corn, a lot of the bigger farmers here in the United States, that it seems like they use like annual ryegrass a lot, some clovers, and I kind of followed suit. So what I do with my corn, I usually, like, let's say I have let's say I have a hairy vetch cover crop and I kill it, and then I tarp it, in April, and I'm planting my corn in May. I'll probably rake the residue off just so it's easier to seed, and then I've kind of got bare soil, right? So I plant my rows of corn, and then there's gonna be weeds coming up, and while we're talking about no till, but I do use like a stirrup hoe sometimes if I have to, or like a hoop hoe, or some kind of like skim tillage that just doing the surface, right? So as weeds come up in that corn, I might go in there a couple times, and weed, right? And weed the plot. When it's let's say I plant in May, I think usually like June, and I can't like, I guess when the corn's about a couple feet high, that's very vague, but like you can probably do it at different times. And there's probably actually some science in big agriculture that tells you exactly when to do it. But I usually wait till the last time I'm going in there and hoeing. I'll hoe out the weeds, and that kind of like gives the soil, it breaks it up a little bit and creates a seed bed. And that's the time that I like to interseed a cover crop into there, just to get that, just to not have bare soil. So it's late enough that you're not going to be out competing the corn, but it's early enough that it can get established. So and by established, I mean that like the crop canopy, the cereal or the corn canopy hasn't shaded out any chance for that cover crop to get sunlight. So yeah, in that bed, like, so in between the corn, like I'll broadcast annual ryegrass and legumes, like summer legumes. So that might be like berseem clover, balanza clover, crimson clover. So yeah, I try to do a lot of like kind of nitrogen producing things. And then I'm not sure I would do like a super thick rate of annual ryegrass because I don't want it impeding the corn growth, taking nutrients away from it. So I might go light on the annual ryegrass, but I do like that mix. So light annual ryegrass and some clovers. And so just last year, like that corn came up, like had the understory, looked beautiful. And I harvested the corn, and my goal was to just let those cover crops just come up right out of the dead, the cut corn. However, there were some weeds in there because again, cover crops aren't going to kill all the weeds. So there was enough weeds in there, and I didn't want to go through and pick them all, that I was like, all right, I could let this cover crop go. I could mow it and see what happens. But it was probably late August or whenever right after I harvested my corn, I tarped it because there was weeds. So I actually mowed that down, or weed whacked it down, tarped it for a couple weeks, and then pulled off tarp and planted a fall cover crop of like cereal rye and crimson clover and things like that. So that was my progression with my corn last year, and I imagine I'll do the same this year because I did like it. So yeah, plant the corn when it's a couple feet tall, or I guess at my last hoeing, my last weeding, interseed annual ryegrass and some legumes, and then harvest the corn in the fall, tarp if needed, pull up the tarp, plant a fall cover crop. Cool.
I'm getting to you. One second.
Good.
And then how do you feel about products that add mycorrhiza to the soil?
Okay, so mycorrhizae fungi is another great benefit of having soil health. Like the mycorrhizae fungi will, some of them, there's different kinds, but some of them will actually stick whatever they stick into a plant and then stick the other thing into like their fungi hyphae into the minerals in the soil and move phosphorus or water or air. So yeah, they do amazing things in like nutrient transfer and just helping things grow. And there's a lot of plants that use mycorrhizae fungi. Some don't, like radishes don't. Some of the brassicas don't use it. So if I were to plant a whole bed, and another key point on mycorrhizae fungi is that it needs an active root to survive and to hang in, to persist. So if I just do radishes in a bed, like the mycorrhizae fungi might get decreased in that bed. So that's where I think, like, if I am doing a winter kill cover crop, for example, or a cover crop that I'm thinking about using radishes in, I like to add something like oats that actually increase mycorrhizae fungi in the soil. So like also crops, you can look up like which crops use it. For example, like garlic likes mycorrhizae fungi relationships. So that's where, I know I didn't talk about garlic too much, but I will plant like a summer oats and peas so that oats are going to be increasing the mycorrhizae fungi in the soil. I then mow them or weed whack them and tarp if needed. But if I don't have to tarp, if there's not that many weeds, then I'll plant the garlic right into that mulch and then put some straw on top to make sure the weeds are down and to cover it for the for the winter. So in effect, I've used those oats to increase mycorrhizal fungi, hopefully, and then planted the garlic as close to immediately after that as possible. So my hope is that there's mycorrhizae fungi relationship persisting in that bed that's going to help the garlic grow. I don't know a whole lot about products as far as mycorrhizae fungi goes, but I guess my thought on that would be, if you put them in the soil but don't give them, but they don't have a home, it's only going to get you so far. Like, so you'll get more bang for your buck if like you're kind of using soil health practices that let that biology persist longer and be more happy. So if you put mycorrhizae fungi in the soil, and then all of a sudden like maybe tilled it like a couple weeks later, like I'm not sure what kind of benefit you would get. I kind of danced around that question, but I guess in general, like, yes, at the right time, like, yes, like some of these additives and microbiology are good. Like I dip my transplants in kelp and like kelp and like different kinds of like biologicals, right? Like I like to dip my transplants in before planting them because it helps get that microbiology into the soil through that transplant. So yeah, I definitely use them as well. I definitely try to use what I can to stimulate biology.
So not as much on cover crop termination, more on bed preparation and garden prep and soil health in general. But there are a couple of questions on essentially starting a garden and moving into a soil health system. So one from Neil, and Neil, we can follow up with you more. Moved from Shelby County, has a garden that is overgrown with invasive ivy, removed the sod, was more, and then added leaf compost and topsoil mix, and asking for suggestions for this first year. I want to be no-till, but at its current state, the soil is very compacted. And then kind of a similar question, for starting a garden, would you recommend starting with tarping when you have a garden that's currently sod? How would you break a hard pan without mechanical tillage?
Yeah. So yeah, okay, good questions there. And I would defer like the list of books, like I think each of those people talk about breaking in a garden. And most of the recommendations come like, even though these are all no-till farmers, right? They almost always say, if you can, like do one good till on it to break up that compaction and then move into like a no-till kind of garden, just to break up that plow pan. And I think like using, if you just tilled it without adding anything, like it might be nil, but use that opportunity to put compost, spread some compost a couple inches and then till that into the soil just to alleviate compaction. When I inherited my garden at this community garden, it was tilled regularly, and then all of a sudden I switched to no-till. I wish I would have thrown a lot of compost down on that last time that they tilled my plot, because that would have, I think, accelerated my goal or my process. I know it sounds reversed, right? But yeah, just getting that organic matter into the soil and then starting would be a little bit more beneficial. So I didn't do that. And even if I did, I would still probably be in the similar situation that there's still some compaction. So I do like the broad fork. So before, maybe once a year on a bed, or I will use that broad fork, or in my case, like a pitchfork, and I'll just, I'll do the broad fork on that bed just to try to crack compaction. And then you cover crops as much as possible, like diverse mixes, killing them with tarps to make sure the weeds are dying. However, like if you can't get that till in, and if you've just started a garden without tillage, and you want to go complete no-till, like, yeah, just be cognizant that you might need the broad fork just to break up that compaction. And I will say too, like if you are starting a garden and you do plan to till once, it's a great time to take a soil test, because then you know what your pH is, what like nutrients are maybe extremely deficient or maybe too much in that area. And that's a good, like when you're tilling, that's a good time to get those amendments into the soil. So with no-till, a lot of times we're like, top dressing the bed with compost or feather meal or some kind of amendment. But if you're starting a garden and you have that chance to like, add lime or sulfur to fix those pH problems, like that's a great time to do it.
Kind of building on that, one thought would also be on breaking hard pan without mechanical tillage is that you could do the tarp for most of the summer or till midsummer, like start now till midsummer, kill the sod, then and at least be able to broadcast cover crop seeds and do like a light incorporation or add compost in order to lightly incorporate cover crops, and then use those cover crop roots to help break up that hard pan layer. So potentially a cover crop mix that Kevin had mentioned with sorghum Sudan grass, or if you're waiting until the fall, planting a cereal rye or other grasses that can really help break up that compacted layer. Maybe.
So, yeah, yep. And then there's always like building up to, I think I said like mulch doesn't kill a cover crop, like just mulching, but if you put enough mulch, it will. So like, if you put enough mulch on it, it'll kill sod too. So, there's folks that will take like cardboard even and put it over sod and maybe wet it. Like, so think lasagna gardening, like a layer of cardboard and then compost on top. You'd want it thick enough that it's going to block out, make sure to block out the regrowth of, or the growth of like those perennial pasture grasses or ivy. So you might need to get it thick, and I'd probably definitely recommend like mowing low. Like if you're changing like grass or a field into a no-till garden, like without tillage, like definitely try to mow, and maybe even a couple times mow, like just get it really low, mow low, so it just kind of weakens those perennial grasses before building up, before lasagna gardening up.
Well, I'm sure we could probably stay here all day together.
All day.
I think we answered most of the ones in the chat. And if you do have follow-up information, feel free to email Kevin and myself. Our emails are in the chat, and we may be able to come out and do a visit with you, or at least have a phone chat to go a little bit more in depth on these practices.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ellie, and thank you, everybody. And yeah, feel free to sign up for a newsletter and just like keep in touch with us. I know we'll be doing more presentations on even how to do seeding rates, for example, of cover crops, like how to choose seeding rates and some different, all things cover crops, all things soil health. So thanks for joining us. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Thank you all. And I'll be sending out a recording as soon as I can. Thanks, Ellie.